What a wonderful world. What a wonderful.
Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we are back looking at the stuff which was passed to the developers for August of 2019, and after having a look at the aviation stuff, the ground forces stuff, it's time to get on to the naval stuff. Unfortunately there's no helicopters today, so we're just going to be focusing on naval. There is some nice and interesting, historical vehicles here. Might not be too useful in the game, but definitely have great histories behind them. So the first one we're having a look at is from Solzhenitsyn, something like that. Anyway, it's the USS Indianapolis, or the CA-35. Now, this was a heavy cruiser from the US, obviously named after Indianapolis in the Indiana state, and pretty much this served all over World War II. It was used pretty much everywhere, and also it has kind of an interesting history because it was part, of course, of the creation of the little boy atomic bomb. It was used to transport some of the enriched uranium, which was used in the atomic bomb at the end of the war, and also parts of it as well. So this will have a lasting image in history as the machine which did that. On top of this as well, it is one of the ships which we cover, which we cover in this series, which actually didn't survive the war. Generally, when you have a look at American ships that are passed to developers, a lot of them survived the war. The Indianapolis, unfortunately, didn't. On July the 30th, in 1945, it was going to Leyte, and it was hit by 2 torpedoes from the Japanese submarine, the I-58, and it sank within 12 minutes. So this thing, after earning 10 battle stars for its World War II service, was sunk incredibly quickly after being hit by the I-58. So even though it has this very prominent history, it took a massive part in World War II itself, basically being all over the place when it came to its operation in the Pacific Theater, and also being part of the Little Boy project. It didn't survive the war, which is kind of sad in a way. The other stuff as well, when we look at its specifications, we're looking at a machine which had 9 203mm, and with the addition of the Hipper, or the Admiral Hipper, and also the Megami, it makes sense to start thinking of these ideas for the Americans as well. So 9 203s, 8 127s, and 2 3-pounder 47mm. So this was when it was built. You can see that it has a little bit of a lack of AA defenses on it, but as with all machines, it seems by the time 1945 came around, they rectified this. So they added 4 sets of quad 40mm, 2 sets of twin 40mm, and 19 single 20mm. So you could either have a machine here which is incredibly good at dealing with other ships, or you can have a machine which is incredibly good at dealing with other ships, but also will just annihilate everything out of the air. Like 4 quad 40s, so that's 16 40mm, plus 4 more, so you're talking about 20 40mm and 19 20mm, incredibly powerful when it comes to that secondary armament status. So overall, I would love to see this in game, especially now that we have the Hipper and the Megami. It seems to fit pretty well into that general area, and the armor itself isn't exactly overbearing. So its belt armor is only 83 to 127mm. The deck itself is 64mm, and the turrets are only 64. So it's not something which is just gonna, brazenly stop all shells coming in. Instead, it's going to be something which will match up very well against the other heavy cruisers that we have in the game. The next vehicle we're having a look at is from Igla Hun. This is looking at the Marty, or as some may know it from a different name, the Standard, I think is how you say that. And this has one of the most interesting histories of any ships that we've covered. So this was actually laid down in 1893 in Copenhagen, Denmark, and it was built as a personal yacht of the Romanov family. And if you don't know who the Romanov Romanov family were. They were the ruling family of Russia, basically the royalty of Russia. Now, obviously, during the Russian Empire with Nicholas II, they needed to travel around Europe, basically doing diplomatic relations, also just visiting different places, and therefore they needed some stuff to be able to travel around in. Well, here comes the Marty, or as it was known at the time, the Standard. So this thing went all around the place. It was filled to the brim of beautiful things such as chandeliers, dining rooms, all of this stuff. Nothing like what you see here. This is it when it was used for military purpose. And then the Romanov dynasty obviously fell during World War One after Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot in Sarajevo. First World War began, and then of course you had the revolution in Russia, which then went on to create the Soviet Union, and obviously the Romanovs were chased out in favor of, people like Lenin and also Stalin and the Communist Revolution. So all of this came about, and therefore this ship was stripped of pretty much everything. It lost its mahogany panels, its chandeliers, and also the 3-pounder Hotchkiss guns, which were on it for personal defense, and the artillery pieces themselves were actually used in the Civil War, which happened afterwards, which is kind of funny. And then the ship itself was renamed from the Standard to the 18 Martyr, and it was used as a transport ship until 1933. Then there was another refit for it in Leningrad at the Marty Yard. So this is where it actually gets its name from. The reason why it's called the Marty or Marty is because it's named after the people who refurbished it and actually refitted the machine. It was given better engines, it was given better guns. Basically they added some 130 millimeters to them, 4 of them to be exact. 76.2 millimeter AA guns were also added, and then 3 45 millimeter anti-aircraft guns and 3 12.7 millimeter Dishkas to use against smaller ships that were around at the time. It also was designed to carry 320 naval mines, and it doesn't really make sense in the context of everything, but 320 naval mines on this machine would be incredibly interesting to see, especially with the naval mechanic, the mine mechanic that we saw last year. So after it was refitted, it was finished in 1936, once again changed its name back to just Marty, so getting rid of the 2 previous names, the Standard and the 18 Martyr, and then in 1938 it was named as the flagship of the Mine Warfare Vessel Squadron of the Baltic Fleet, and in 1941 it was used during the Great Patriotic War, and then it was mainly used as a machine to defend Leningrad at the time, which is now of course nowadays called St. Petersburg. So during the siege of Leningrad, what you'll find is there was a lot of ships actually present there when it came to the Soviet Navy. A lot of them were used for counter-barraging the Germans who were going on the offensive to try and take Leningrad, and this was one of the machines that was used in that defense. It was also used to transport goods and soldiers and machinery. It was also used as a target for many German bombs, and even though it took light damage, it was still able to fight on. And then eventually in 1957, after the war, it wasn't really used for much. It was mainly used as a floating barracks, and then by 1957, it was renamed as the Oka, and then in the 1963, it was towed to Estonia and it was scrapped. So this thing had a long service history. We're talking about 70 years at this point, and it went from being a royalty transport to a mine layer to another, soldier or army transport, then took part in the Civil War, of course, or the Revolution, and then it was scrapped eventually after being useful in, the Siege of Leningrad. So there's so many little things to the history of this machine which bring it on board as a really fun little thing. So it would be nice just to have it in game, just so people could learn about the history of it when we talk about its usefulness. I mean, it's got got some main guns for 130s, 7.76.2, so I think, why not? Let's chuck it in. It's not very fast, but that's okay. The next ship we're looking at is the Tribal Class Destroyer. Now, we already have a Tribal Class in game, but this is a different Tribal Class, and this is why following British nomenclature or designations can be incredibly annoying. So this is from Admiral Radeon, and he's talking about the first set of Tribal Class Destroyers. Obviously, the Tribal Class Destroyers that you may know are from the 1930s, mainly 1936. Those are the ones that we currently have in game. The earlier Tribal Classes were built from 1905 to 1908, and then launched in 1907 to 1910. These were revolutionary designs, but nowhere near as capable as the 1930s Tribal Classes. And also, they were known as the F class, and also at the time you had the G class, which were some other destroyers which were built around the time, which is not to be confused by the mid-30s G classes. Do you see the problem here? So when it comes to all of these things, it's a little bit confusing, but the Tribal Classes were made alongside the River Classes at the turn of the century, and the idea was to try and facilitate, their arrival. So instead of just having some torpedo boat destroyers in the form of the River Classes, you would also have some Tribal Classes to support them in the overall roles that you require. On top of this, they wanted to make a machine which had a lot of speed behind it. We're talking about 60 kilometers an hour at the time. This meant that the Tribal Class needed massive engines with a horsepower of 12,500 shp versus the River Class, which only had 7,700 at the time. And by installing these huge, massive engines, which were also different technology to the previous ones, what you ended up with was a very fast and high-tech design, but it ate fuel. It absolutely went through a bunch of fuel, and there's a wonderful little quote here, actually. More alarmingly, however, they were only provided with 90 tons of bunkerage, so 90 tons of fuel space, basically. And with high fuel consumption resulting from the unheard of power of 12,500 shp, they were very uneconomical and had a severely limited radius of action. A Radeon Amazon once used 9.5 tons of oil each simply to raise steam for a 3-mile return journey to a fuel depot. So even though these were used generally in the Dover patrols during World War I, they were also used as part of the 6th Flotilla. What you find is an incredibly interesting and innovative machine which has its problems when it comes to the economy of it. And generally as well, the other thing to think about is the Tribal Class DDs were slightly different depending on which one you want to pick. So this means that you could add in completely different machines when it comes to the weaponry, when it comes to the design. They were all just slightly different in their own way. The general armaments of them were the first 5 ships that were made, so the Afridi, the Cossack, the Gurkha, Mohawk, and the Tatar. These all had an armament of 3-inch guns, so 12-pounders, two single 18-inch torpedo tubes, which carried the 18-inch Mark V torpedoes. And then the next second programs, the 06 and 07 one, which was the Saracen and the Amazon Tribal Class destroyers, and also the third program of 08 and 09, the Crusader, Maori, Nubian, and Viking and Zulu destroyers, so a crop of 7 of them. These all replaced the 12-pounders with a pair of BL 4-inch 102mm cannons, with one mounted forwards and the other on the quarterdeck, and then they switched the Mark V torpedoes to the Mark 7s, and they were slightly better, of course, than the Mark V torpedoes. So overall, what you have is 2 sets of different ships which are under the same name and with completely different armament. And just to add a little bit more confusion, the original 5 ships, the Afridi, Cossack, the Gurkha, the Mohawk, and the Tatar, after October 1908, were modified by adding another pair of 12-pounder guns, making 5 76mm cannons plus the 2 single torpedo tubes. So you have all of the these different modifications if you wanted to put many of the different ones in game. But basically what you would have is sets of destroyers which were incredibly fast. They would be quite lightweight when it comes to their armor. They would have okay firepower, but against other destroyers that get eaten up, of course, because of the monsters that we have in the game. So yeah, it's definitely interesting. Also in 1916, they realized the German destroyer guns outranged the British 4-inch guns, so the Viking replaced her forward 4-inch gun with a 6-inch Mark 7 on a P3 mounting, which added 16.5 tons of weight. There was also others, such as the Afridi, which changed the 12-pounder guns in exchange for two 4.7 Mark III to Mark VI guns on a P6 mounting. So you have just so many different options when it comes to these wonderful little tribal class destroyers. And yes, of course, they're not little, but compared to, once again, what we have in the game, they are pretty small. It would be lovely to see some representation of the early tribal classes in game. We've already talked about stuff like the insect class, which I think would be nice to see, and this would be an interesting machine to put in that area of rank 2, which is kind of very fun. The next machine we're going to look at is one which switched sides a few times. So you got the IGM Patrol Boat number 102, and this is done by Leroy Only. Now, the patrol boat number 102 did not start life as a patrol boat number 102. It started life as the USS Stuart, the DD-224, in September 1919, and it was used mainly as a patrolling vessel in the Atlantic Squadron, and then it was damaged, possible during an exercise, so she went to Newport, Rhode Island for repairs, and then she was moved patrolling the Pacific in the Philippines, and once again got broken again, but then was used after repairs to aid the relief efforts because of the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923. So the early years, even though this machine was not involved in World War I, it came out after World War I, it definitely had a prolific story already, even though it hasn't really seen combat. So something I do want to point out is it would be nice if anyone who makes these nice pass to developers stuff, paragraphs are amazing things. They make stuff much easier to read in general. This was just absolute hell to read. I actually had to do a text-to-speech thing just to keep along with it, because there's a lot of information here, and it's all really, really great information, but at the same time, a block of text is very hard to read. Like, compare that to, here where it's broken up incredibly well into little sections. This is basically what would be much better. Anyway, so at this point, the USS Stuart has been involved in relief efforts, mainly patrolling, and then, of course, World War II happens. After being part of a bunch of patrol duties in the 20s, then its main areas where its ships are between are Yangtze, then Wuhu, Nanking, Shanghai, and Chenglin, basically moving around people who are safeguarding U.S. interests. And then in 1939, it was ordered back to Manila when the Second World War broke out, and it was used for patrol duties in the Philippines. And then, after the hostilities with Japan, starting on the 8th of December 1941, she was used as a convoy escort, before being assigned on the 3rd of February 1942 to the Dutch Rear Admiral Carol Dorman's American, British, Dutch, Australian striking force, which is a wonderful thing to go along. And then there was a decisive battle for this machine. The Battle of Badung Straits, the Stuart was hit very hard. It was hit twice by two Japanese destroyers, and the boats, the Stuart, was taken to a dry dock to try and repair it because it had flooding everywhere, the steering and the engine room was screwed, everything was pretty much done on it, so it linked back to Surabaya, and because it was one of the most heavily damaged ships, it was the first to enter the floating dry dock. Now, what happened at the time is the Japanese, at the time, the same day, the crew left the port because they were being overrun by the Japanese forces at the time. So everybody left the ports, and they decided to try and blow it up. So they put a bunch of charges inside, 2 80-pound demolition charges, which blew up the sonar suite and also another prolific area, probably trying to just save probably to make sure that the information did not fall into Japanese hands. And then the entire dry dock was scuttled, meaning that the whole thing was sank, including the Stuart, which was there. So everything was just basically sank when it came to it. So they annihilated everything after another bomb midship hit it and also hit the dry dock. So the Stuart at this point is completely underwater, drowned along with everything around it. Then the Japanese come in, they decide to raise the dry dock, which had the Stuart onto it, and in February 1943, where the machine was then pulled up, it was repaired, refloated, and refitted. And it was refitted in September 43 with 2 ex-Dutch Army 75mm, then 2 12.7 50 caliber machine guns, 2 Type 3 6.5mm machine guns, and also a lot of the old equipment was thrown out in favor of some depth charges and some Mark II rails and a new sonar. So now it becomes the IGM patrol boat number 102. It becomes technically what is known as the PB-102, and it's used on the Japanese side. So after being an American vessel, it is now turned into a Japanese vessel where the Japanese used it. Then it went through different phases, once again was refitted again with slightly different guns, but the main thing that kept happening is this machine just went through a lot of trials and tribulations. It had 2 torpedoes fired at it in November 1943 when it was attacked by a submarine. Then it was passed by 2 American destroyers who could have absolutely annihilated it, but it got lucky. Then, once again, near the end of the war, after spending a lot of time in docks trying to fix its propeller, trying to fix its engine issues, because at this point, it's about 20 years old, suffered massive damage, been underwater for an incredibly long time. There's a lot of stuff which is going wrong with it. And then in 1945, it was attacked by 2 PBY Catalinas and hit with a lot of bomb fragmentations, 100 holes in the machine, damage to the radar, rudder cable, everything. And the damage meant that it was equipped with more weapon systems once again. So 2 torpedo drop collars, and then also some other stuff on top of it, some extra guns. Then, after the war, it actually survived. So after being on the American side, and then being scuttled and sank, after being raised by the Japanese, after being refitted at least 3 or 4 separate times by the Japanese, used by the Japanese, and then the Japanese surrendering, the Americans then take it back to America, and then in 1946, it was decommissioned on the 5th of March, and then it was used as a target ship by F-6Fs, which just pillared it with rockets, 50 cal fire, 40mm shells, and 3-inch rounds, and it was sank. So it was just annihilated after the war. It's an insane story when it comes to it, because what happened Not just between, the years that we talked about, but between 1945 and 46, during the Japanese surrender, what happened was when the Americans found it, they realized it was completely rat infested. It was just disgraceful. It had just been annihilated, and they fumigated it, they fixed it, and they brought it back to America, only to be smashed up as a target ship. So it's an insane story. Absolutely insane story for a machine. Built by the Americans, used by the Americans, then captured and used by the Japanese, then back to the Americans, then annihilated. The main difference between this machine and others you may see is the smokestack. This was actually molded by the Japanese to fit them both together instead of keeping them separate. So that is why that smoke funnel is in one place. And as I said, the weapon systems, this is all the different ones. So this is with the Japanese refits. This is with the first Japanese refit. So two 75mm Krupp guns, two 50 cals, two Type 3 machine guns. Then what was added to it is some more AA guns, so three 25mm ones, and obviously another depth charge thrower. Then the second refit, they added 80mm guns, plus some more 25mm, and the third refit, which happened in 1945 at this point, it was given some torpedo drop collars and also another depth charge thrower. So it's just an insane story when it comes to it, and one which once again may not be the most useful ship in the game, and you could technically give it to the Americans and also give it to the Japanese. I think it makes more sense in Japanese tree than the American tree, but it would be lovely to see. But the story behind it is just magnificent. The next one is from Super Cacti, and I'm actually going to be doing a set of videos with Super Cacti and also some of the other guys behind the independent Dutch tech trees when we're going to talk about them, very similar to the Swedish videos we did about a year ago or so. And the idea is just to get some information, get some ideas out there so you guys know what is actually on offer. Because one thing that I found while talking about the Swedish stuff, a lot of people didn't think that Sweden had a ton of vehicles, especially when it came to its ground vehicles. They were worried about Sweden having a lot of copycat vehicles from other nations, and I feel like the Dutch are kind of in the same boat, where a lot of people look at the tech trees and think, there's probably going to be a lot of copycat stuff. But to be honest, the Swedish and the Dutch, they have a decent amount of, the national vehicles which were built in Holland or in the Netherlands, depending on who you want to ask, I suppose. And they should be represented in the game in some way or another. We already have a few of them which are built as user model vehicles, which I've talked about on the channel. But yeah, look forward to that. That should be coming out in the next week or so. But the independent Dutch Naval Force tech tree is just here to show that the Dutch themselves could easily have a naval tech tree put into the game if it was required. Now, the only problem with these more minor nations is if you can create a different set of... if you can create like a different tech tree for each part of the game. So it needs a ground forces, an aviation, a naval, and a helicopter tech tree now. So if you can cover all four of those bases, you're pretty good. The Dutch can easily cover the naval parts, as you can see here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this for the videos that we do about this issue, because it's just going to be a lot of fun going through them, and why not just leave it to the people who've worked on this stuff for a few years instead of just me having a look at it from a layman's point of view. So I'll leave it there. Some fun and interesting suggestions, very heavy on the history side, and I'm very happy to see that. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Ambrosius McClellan, B. Young, Blackie, Daniel Stanton, John Ryman, Joseph Anders, Martinez, Mopar 1969, Moxie, Super Cacti, Uyans Terry, and Elove Goats, and of course Seductive Trash Can for supporting the channel.